Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Deanna Minnick, and today we're going to be talking about how to build a better brain. And you're going to have lots of lifestyle tips in this webinar to help you keep sharp and to keep you on your toes and keep your memory working well. So as you can imagine, this is a very hot topic for many people. It's something that so many people are very concerned about. When people were surveyed, what their biggest concern was, 65% of people said that they were most fearful of losing their mental sharpness. And when we lose our mental sharpness, of course, that's when we feel more dependent, we're not as functional, we're not able just to be on the move, on the go, and doing the things that we really love. So that's why we thought at Harmony Hill that it would be very important to really cover this topic very thoroughly to give you some takeaways. Now keep in mind that this is an educational webinar. It's not intended to take the place of advice from your own physician or physicians or be a means of diagnosing or treating an illness. So if there's something that's intriguing in this presentation, I would encourage you to follow up with your doctor, talk with your health professionals, and see if there's anything here that could apply to you and your life. So surely, losing one's mind is clearly top of mind in this day of age. In fact, I recall that I believe somewhere it was announced that by the year 2020, we'll really be focused even more on the brain because mental illness, cognitive issues, all of these types of health conditions or related health conditions will be an epidemic. They're already an epidemic, quite honestly, and it's 2014. So the trend is only supposed to escalate. So as we get older, as we move into the aged years, obviously there are different ways to view how that might look. And so looking at this picture, you can see what one approach might be, having a very debilitating, very somber, not a very enlivening approach to one's older years. But there are other ways. There are surely other ways to enhance one's longevity, vitality. Here we see these ladies talking and eating and socializing is definitely seen to be important for our health and especially for our brain. It keeps our brain active. It keeps it what we would call plastic. And maybe we even go further into being vital. You know, one of the key words, vitality. We hear a lot about that in traditional medicine, but we don't hear a lot about that in Western medicine. We don't hear people going to the doctor to become more vital. We might hear terms like anti-aging and such, but that's perhaps not really the true essence of what we're getting at. What we're looking at with vitality is keeping our mind sharp, keeping our body fluid and mobile, and really maintaining a good quality of life into our latter decades. So here is a statistic from the World Health Organization. What they stated was that by the year 2020, the number of patients with dementia will have grown to 19 million throughout the world, with 2/3 of them being Alzheimer's disease cases. Now, this again is consistent with what I was mentioning about the escalation of the trend on mental illness, dementia. It's the age of the brain. We're learning so much about the brain and how it works. When we look at what we call cognitive impairment, and cognitive impairment means when we're not able to fully have the capacity of our cognition or our thinking. So one of the things that puts us at the greatest risk is getting older. And as we get older, our memory, our mind starts to naturally decline. So one of the things that I noticed when I went into the literature a little bit more on aging is that the thing that keeps us most young is the element of flow. And when you look at the brain, there is something called neuronal plasticity. Neuronal plasticity refers to the ability of the neurons in the brain to speak to each other very rapidly in a fluid way. The more that we can do that, the quicker our thoughts come, the quicker we can say things. Then also in the heart, if we come down from the brain, there's also in the literature evidence of heart rate variability being very important for the aging of the heart. So the more that we can quickly respond to a situation, maybe it's a stressful situation where the heart has a lot of variability in its heart rate rhythm, that keeps us young. And then down to the gut, we move from the brain to the heart to the gut. Metabolic flexibility. As we get older, typically our metabolism changes. I'm sure you know that. And so what happens is that we become less fluid in our ability to switch between carbohydrate and fat metabolism. So what we want to do is keep that flexible as well. So can you see how all three of these things, brain, heart, and gut, are all dependent upon the degree of flow in our bodies? So back in the 20th century, which isn't all that long ago, back about 14 years ago, and even back when I was going to school in the 1980s, 1990s, we learned a lot about the brain as being very hardwired. So if you did something to the brain, it couldn't change. It was incapable of regenerating nerve cells. It couldn't create new connections. So if you did something, whether it was brain trauma or even drinking alcohol or just even through age, there was this thought that basically that was it. Whatever you just did to your brain, it will never undo itself. Now, fortunately, we have some good news, and this is relatively good news. The brain of the 21st century is thought to be remarkably plastic. Now, when we say plastic, we mean that it can adapt, that the neurons are very fluid and flexible amongst themselves. And also, we know that we can have our nerve cells replaced, that they are not they just don't die off and then never replenish. And of course, there are certain things that help those nerve cells to replenish more than others. And the brain can form new connections. It can rewire. And one of the things that helps us to rewire is to be thinking differently about things, to shake up our routine, to do crossword puzzles that are different, to take a new way to work if we're working and we're driving, to meet new people, put ourselves in new situations. The brain loves that. You are priming the brain to really be receptive and neuronally plastic when you do that. So, and if you think about it, as we get older, you can tell how people don't feel as comfortable with changing their environment, changing their routine. It's seen as stressful. But in all actuality, some of that can be good for the brain. Now, here's a very interesting study statistic. Many studies have shown that people with type 2 diabetes have a greater incidence of Alzheimer's disease. Fascinating, isn't it, to think that there's a correlation between chronic diseases like diabetes and dementia? Well, there is, and I'm going to take you through this path of understanding much more about what this entails. But what this tells us outright is that there might be a connection between our body's ability to handle blood sugar and our body's brain health. So if one of the first things to be thinking about and talking with your health professionals about is that when you have elevated blood sugar or blood sugar distortions, issues with your blood sugar that show that it's not normal, one of the best things to do is to really get that back into balance. That could be preventative for really your brain health and what happens to you long term. Now, this was a very interesting study. This comes from Dr. Carol Greenwood at the University of Toronto, who did some very nice work looking at the impact of blood sugar and cognition. So in this study, it was a relatively small study. It was 21 people, and these are people they're not in a hospital or they're not in a metabolic ward. They're just in their homes, and they have type 2 diabetes. She had them come into the lab and try out a couple of different meals, and she had them try these meals and then take a cognition test. So in one of the meals, she had them have a very low glycemic index meal, which means that it would not change the blood sugar in a detrimental way. It would be pretty healthy for the blood sugar. You wouldn't see a huge spike. And then she had them have a high glycemic meal, and the high glycemic meal would make their blood sugar spike. And then finally, water, just no food at all. And what they showed is that the people that had the low glycemic index meal seemed to do best, and that the people with the high glycemic index meal seemed to do the worst when it came to cognition and any kind of cognitive performance tasks. So fascinating, isn't it, that just one meal can determine how we perform on a cognitive test. And I'm sure that you know that when you have a meal, especially around the lunchtime hour, and then you might feel sleepy afterwards, your cognition isn't all that good. So it might be related to what that meal did to your blood sugar. There are some studies, some initial studies on artificial sweeteners, and me personally, I'm not a big fan of artificial sweeteners. Just even the term artificial sweeteners denotes that it's probably not something that's good for you. So some of these artificial sweeteners seem to have some neurological impacts. So they might even impact the functioning of the brain. So in animal studies and some cell studies, there have been some findings that I think have been intriguing. So some of the studies show reduced memory in animals eating these large amounts of these sweeteners, enhanced oxidative stress, which means that you put the body under undue production of these free radicals, which are not healthy. They actually cause aging. Neurometabolic dysfunction. So having, again, here we see the connection between the nerves and metabolism. So seeing that there can be some issues even with the mitochondria, and seeing how we metabolize fuel, that can be impacted by consumption of these artificial sweeteners. And then there are some initial studies showing that these artificial sweeteners might change our gut microbiome. So that means the bugs in our gut, all those microorganisms in our gut, and in fact we've got more microorganisms in the gut than we do cells of our own human body. And what we see is that if we change that climate for the microbiome, that changes the bugs that live there. So if we change the acidity, if we change the overall fuel source that we give them, that could change the bugs. So it's not always a good thing to be changing the bugs in other ways. And it looks like these artificial sweeteners, some of them might be changing the microbiome in such a way that might not be as beneficial. So now here's an aha. Did you know that there's such a thing as type 3 diabetes? Now, for those of you who don't know, there are currently two forms of diabetes that have been long known. Type 1 diabetes is the kind of diabetes where you get a shot of insulin to help you to deal with the carbohydrate content in a meal. Type 2 diabetes is typically a form of diabetes that happens later in life and is more connected to lifestyle, and that can also be helped by making lifestyle choices. Type 3 diabetes is really specific in the way of being a very brain-specific form of diabetes. And we don't see medical doctors using this term, but it's in the scientific literature where researchers are talking about the impact of type 3 diabetes and how things like Alzheimer's disease and diabetes are related. Now, one of the issues with dementia is the overaccumulation of a protein in the brain called amyloid. Now, amyloid, when it's the sticky protein. So when there's too much of this sticky protein in the brain, it starts to basically coat different structures in the brain that make thinking not as fluid. And what we're finding out is that insulin is the hormone that your body produces in order to deal with the glucose, the sugar that you take in your diet. And when you have a change or a dysfunction in the amount of insulin that you're producing in the body, what we're learning is that that can change the amount of amyloid in the body as well. So what we're seeing, let me just show you the pathway. Perhaps that's easier to look at. And this is a little bit of a science-y pathway, but let me take you through it because it is pretty fascinating. And it's easy to follow once it's explained. So if you look right in the middle, you'll see a box that says insulin resistance, right? You see that? So now insulin resistance, this is a very common condition that many people have already. What this means is that your body is producing lots of insulin in order to deal with the carbohydrate, but for some reason, your body, your cells are not receiving the signal of insulin. So it causes the body to make even more because it doesn't feel like it's being heard. So the pancreas starts putting out more insulin. So what ends up happening is you've got a lot of nutrition, a lot of glucose floating on the outside of the cell, but it's not getting into the inside of the cell. So there's a lot of glucose on the outside of the cell, a lot of insulin on the outside of the cell, and this can be very damaging for the body because then we start getting glycated proteins, things like hemoglobin A1C, which we all know is a measure of diabetes. So follow me now with the arrows going to the left. And what happens in insulin resistance is that we change the transportation of amyloid beta. Now, amyloid beta is just the fancy science term to talk about this protein. So insulin resistance, right off the bat, we know changes how amyloid is transported in the brain and throughout the body. And if you look further, this situation of insulin resistance changes some messenger in the cell called GSK3, which leads to the production of even more amyloid. So not only are you changing the transport, you're changing the production. And then what tends to happen, now follow me over that long arrow going from left at the top and all the way over to the right where it says amyloid beta accumulation and aggregation. This is where we start to get clustering of all that amyloid, and that, over time, is a hallmark of dementia. Now, with all that amyloid accumulating and aggregating, what tends to happen is you get an upregulation of inflammation. And inflammation, having this brain on fire, if you will, is not a very healthy situation. You don't want inflammation in your body at all. You want to be cooling it down and making sure that your body's in a healthy state. So the inflammation just makes the insulin resistance even worse. You see how it's kind of like this loop? So when we have issues with blood sugar, that's why it's so important to get those handled and to work those through with your doctor, because you can see that over time this cascade can lead to some changes at the cellular level that can set a person up for something like dementia. So what do? How do you create a personalized approach to healthy brain aging? Well, there's so many things you can do. Just look around this pinwheel of options. So there's dealing with stress better. You know, stress really does a number on the brain. Not very good. Makes certain parts of the brain shrink and not respond well over time. There are emotional issues that you can be working on. Looking at food, really looking at trying to get more physical movement, more mental exercise. Gosh, there's so many things that you can do. So even if you just pick one of these and focus on that, maybe it's just thinking differently. Maybe it's getting rid of all the inflammation. Maybe it's looking at your social networks and community. Maybe it's the amount of sleep that you're getting. So there are many, many things that are going to be changing brain activity. One of the things that we're going to focus on right now is getting a little bit deeper into the nutritional aspects. Food first is always my approach with me being a nutrition professional, so that's what I think of, and that's usually my go-to place. So let's talk about what we eat and how that ties into brain function. Really important to know that the next bite of food, this is what I often tell people, the next bite of food becomes the future of your being. So really think carefully about what you're putting in your body, right? Very, very important. It's not something we should be lackadaisical about. We really need to be conscientious because we are building the matrix, which is always changing, of our body. right? So we are taking that food in, changing our structure. That structure is changing our mood, it's changing our brain, it's changing our mind. So starting here is a really good place because this is where we have a lot of control. Now, if we look at the Western diet, what you might be seeing if you're looking at my screen is a picture of a lot of brown, yellow, and white foods, not very nutritious foods, overly cooked foods. What we see is that the Western diet is not correlated, and I would say that this is a typical general plate that you might see on the Western diet, the standard American diet. We don't see a very good correlation with cognition when people are eating this way over time. It's much better if you eat like you live in the Mediterranean. There are some nice studies coming out now showing that having a Mediterranean-style diet seems to be better for the brain. It gives longer cognitive performance over time. So that's really good news. So here's an example of one of those studies. This came out in 2009. And if you just look at the left here, what we're looking at are a lot of these curves. And if you can't see it, just listen to me and I'll walk you through it. So essentially, what they showed in this study was that the more that people followed a Mediterranean diet, over time, the less of a chance they had of developing mild cognitive impairment. And that became more and more evident with the longer that they were on, again, this way of eating, and the more compliant they were. Now, here's another graphic that comes into that. When they take these people that already had mild cognitive impairment and then track them over time following a Mediterranean diet, what they showed is that for people that were very compliant with the Mediterranean diet, that they, in the end, did not end up getting Alzheimer's disease to the degree that the other group that wasn't very compliant to the Mediterranean diet did. So there's a big difference. There's a several-fold difference between being compliant with the Mediterranean diet and developing Alzheimer's disease versus not being compliant with the Mediterranean diet. So what's the takeaway here? Mediterranean diet. What do we think of when we think of the Mediterranean? We think of fresh fish, coastal areas, whole unprocessed foods, lots of vegetables, lots of spices, lots of herbs, and really moderate amounts of things like dairy or lots of flesh meats. The focus really is on olive oil, tomatoes, vegetables, and again, don't forget the herbs and spices, which are incredibly protective for the brain. Here's another study, a very recent study, 2013 study, and also a long-term study. It was greater than 13 years, and they showed that, and there were many, many people in this study, over 16,000 women, so that tells you that it's probably a more strong study. What they showed was that long-term adherence to the Mediterranean diet was associated with better cognition. So the longer, again, that somebody is following the Mediterranean diet, the better off you're going to be. That's really promising. So it kind of gives you that incentive to stick with something as long as you can and shake it up as you go. So the Mediterranean diet doesn't mean that you eat the same things every day. You can shake it up, but really to be in tune with making sure that you eat healthy if you're concerned about your brain. So as many of you who know me know about me is that I'm very much into colors. I'm looking at the colors of foods that we're eating, and one of the smartest ways to a better brain is to make sure that we do have more colors. And I'm going to talk about what those colors are and how they correlate to the brain. So we know that everybody more or less eats plants. Maybe not the same plants, but it doesn't matter if you're an omnivore, paleo eater, you're a vegetarian, you're a fruitarian, a vegan, flexitarian. It doesn't matter what you are, but essentially all of us are connected by eating plants, right? So where do we find these plants? Where do we find these plant compounds that are oh so colorful? Well, there's fruits and vegetables, of course. Those are the first things that probably come to your mind. But then also nuts, seeds, whole grains, legumes, herbs, and spices. Lots of different options here for variety. So what if you had a diet, a way of eating that encompassed more of these things? Would you benefit? Well, what we see from the Mediterranean diet, which is full of these things, is clearly yes. Now, I often say that the way that people are eating right now, in general, in industrialized countries, is that they're not eating very healthy foods, and it's almost like we have a color deficiency. And again, when I look at that plate of food, I call it the brown, yellow, white, high advanced glycation end product, high processed, high inflammation, high dementia, high aging diet. When we eat all of those burnt to a crisp, grilled, fried, no color eating, that to me speaks to a not very healthy brain diet. We do know that most people have a phytonutrient gap. And the color that people fall most short on is blue-purple. Look at these numbers. 88% of people surveyed fall short in purple-blue compounds. So that's pretty concerning when we're talking about the brain. And the reason why is because the brain needs those blue-purple compounds. We're seeing some very interesting research, especially in animal studies, where they find that when they feed the animals blueberries, that those blueberry pigments make their way into certain parts of the brain that correspond with learning and with memory. Isn't that fascinating? To think that we can modify our learning and memory. Now, again, this is just shown in animals, but just by eating blueberries. And if we took the human equivalent of those animal studies, it would amount to about half a cup of blueberries a day. So there are thousands of these different phytonutrients. Everything that we're eating that is plant-based is going to have something here for us to be looking at. And truly, they are more than just protective antioxidants. You have probably heard this term antioxidant before. So essentially, they are very protective. They're going to prevent our brain cells, our neurons in our brain, from really going down that aging path. But they also provide some structure and function in the way of just a structural component. So again, as I mentioned, those blueberry compounds going into the brain and helping with cognition. So now another thing that these phytonutrients do that is helpful for the brain is if we look at the three major processes that happen in the cell. So you're seeing here lots of different pathways, and all these pathways, this is like if we were just zooming into a cell and looking at all the different communication that was happening at the level of the cell. And what we would see is that there's a lot of crosstalk, a lot of inter-talking between the pathways. And the three main pathways are inflammatory response, energy utilization, which speaks to insulin sensitivity, and stress response. So these three things are interconnected. If we change inflammation, we're going to be changing stress response. If we change energy utilization, we'll be changing inflammation. So what we know about these phytonutrients is that they get into certain places in this cellular network, and they're able to positively change these three different pathways, which is a good thing because these pathways are at the root of many diseases, including inflammation. So one of the things that phytonutrients also do that help to protect the brain is that within the cell, now this is, again, a little bit more science-y, but I want you to think very broad level here. What these phytonutrients do is that they create some communication in the cell that leads to changes in gene expression. So these phytonutrients are talking to our DNA, and when they're talking to the DNA starts to produce even more protective enzymes. So we're actually changing not just the actual physical compound of the phytonutrient isn't just protective, but they are creating a ripple effect of protection within the brain by upregulating certain genes that lead to better detoxification, better transport, better stress response. So overall, that's a really good thing. Now, one other thing we want to note is I talk about the brain and the gut a lot, and I just interviewed Dr. David Perlmutter for the Detox Summit. By the way, if you don't know about the Detox Summit, please explore it. It's detoxsummit.com, a free opportunity to get lots of education and to listen to all kinds of experts during the first week of August in 2014. And essentially what Dr. Perlmutter said in that interview that I had with him is that the gut may very well be the first brain, because there's so much going on in there. There's so much happening. And that what we do in the gut impacts our behavior, our mood, even our thinking can be in some ways determined by the gut microflora that we have. So there is a lot there with the gut. If your gut is not in good working order, that's another area you're going to want to focus on with your health professional. So let us dive into looking at which colors, which nutrients are important for brain health. And again, I view those through the eyes of color. So red food phytonutrients, really important. Lots of different phytonutrients here to go from. Lycopene, which is great, and you find that in tomatoes. Anthocyanins, astaxanthin. So if we look at the foods that we're talking about, things like berries, anything that's red that occurs in nature is going to have these nice protective red compounds. Now let's look a little bit more specifically to the brain. I went through the research and looked at what are the red foods that you could be eating in order to impact your cognition. Well, this study, very intriguing again, relatively recent, just 2 years old, 16,000 participants. It was in the Nurses' Health Study. And over time, what they showed is that these nurses that were eating berries seemed to have a delay in cognitive aging by up to 2.5 years. So what that means is that the people that were eating berries had a bit more longevity of good brain health, that blueberries and strawberries together were associated with slower rates of cognitive decline. I think it's so important to be including berries. And where I live in the Pacific Northwest, fortunately, we do get lots of them. So I'm pretty happy about that. But you need to find them, even if they're frozen. Keep them around year-round. Now, the other compound that I mentioned on that first slide talking about red phytonutrients is lycopene. And look at the picture of the tomatoes that you have here, right? This is where we find lycopene. Make sure you cook your tomatoes. You get even more lycopene. The lycopene in those tomatoes becomes available to the body. And there was a study in rats, which I'm talking about on this slide, which showed that lycopene was able to reduce the effects of any diabetes-associated cognitive decline. So what that means is that lycopene can help to interfere with the connection between diabetes and the lack of cognition. So that's a good thing, right? This study was done in diabetic rats. Also, we know that for the brain health, we want to be looking at things like stroke. And in this human study, what they showed was that men who had the highest quartile, the highest level of lycopene in their blood, had the lower risks of stroke compared to men with lower amounts of lycopene in their blood. Now, that's really interesting because there are many different plant compounds, but it seemed like this one was the one that was most protective for stroke. What about orange? Is orange an important color for the brain? Well, when I think of orange, I think of beta-carotene in the carrots. I think of bioflavonoids in citrus. So what do we know about orange? Well, when I think orange, I truly think salmon, quite honestly. And that orange color is coming from a variety of different things. But essentially, what we're thinking about even more than the orange color here is the omega-3 fats. Omega-3 fats are very important for the brain. In fact, much of our brain composition, our brain matter, is made of fat. 60% of the brain is lipid. When we say lipid, that just means fat. So we want good, healthy lipids. We want good, healthy fats in our brain, and the omega-3s tend to be anti-inflammatory. So that's important. We're going to want those. Now, here are two nerve cells in the brain, how they're talking side by side and corresponding. And what we know is that the omega-3 fat lining in the cell membrane will add to how these two cells speak to one another. So that it makes the communication between the neurons very fluid. It goes back and forth. That's a good thing in the brain, right? Because then our thinking is faster, our actions are faster, our speaking is faster. So omega-3 fats add to what we would call this synapse, kind of the transfer and communication between neurons back and forth. Now, you might be thinking, well, is fish so good for me? Should I be taking supplements? Well, that's something you have to talk about with your doctor. We know that fish in large amounts may not be such a good thing because it's contaminated with methyl mercury, and that can even negatively impact our cognition. So what about omega-3 supplements? Well, if your levels are low, your doctor might say, yes, you need to be on a supplement. Or if your triglycerides are high, or you have some other indication, it might warrant taking omega-3 supplements. So what we see here in this study, and this was in 2011, is that omega-3 supplementation helped to benefit cognition, mood, and reduce the risk of dementia in older people. So yes, very important. And again, I think that the mood aspect ties into our cognition, our ability to think as well. What about coconut? Many people ask me about coconut oil in the brain. There's actually a product on the market that's just focused on people with dementia and having coconut oil. And the coconut oil seems to be important as a well, essentially an alternate fuel source for the brain when the brain's not able to use glucose very well. Now, this is especially when we see more the demented brain or when it's been impacted by diabetes. So coconut gives us these short and medium chain fats that the brain can more readily process. So that can be a good thing. So I've cited here a number of different things from different studies, how it reduces the formation of fat, it increases the mitochondrial oxidation of fat, so it actually helps you burn more fat, so that's a good thing. It upregulates how our body metabolizes by changing certain gene factors, certain factors that are close to the DNA. And we start to see, too, some changes in the overgrowth of microorganisms, which can be very good. And probably most important for when we're talking about dementia is that it can slow the effects of amyloid on neurons. It can change whatever detrimental effects that amyloid is having on the neurons. So it could be good as well, as I mentioned, for people already with dementia, just to have some coconut oil. Curcumin. I'm really big on spices. I think that spices are a big deal. I think we need more in our cooking. And I think that curcumin, which comes from turmeric, turmeric is the mother spice that contains the curcuminoids. And what we see is that in India, where they consume a lot of curry, which contains the curcumin from the turmeric, we had seen for many years that they have lower rates of dementia relative to other parts of the country and of the world. And so it was thought that it was the curcumin that was being so protective. And so what we see here, what this study was reporting, it says the potential role of curcumin as a preventive agent against brain aging and neurodegenerative disorders has been recently reinforced by epidemiological studies showing that in India, where this spice is widely used in the daily diet, there is a lower incidence of Alzheimer's disease than in the USA. So let's get more turmeric. Buy good quality turmeric, organic turmeric, so that you don't get any contamination with metals or any other things that may not be desirable for the brain. Or even fresh turmeric, which is a root. You can grate it. So curcumin by itself, if we take it again from the turmeric, and again it's this yellow gold compound, it might be synergistic with DHA. DHA is one of the fish oil fatty acids. So there might be a good connection there. And in fact, we know that putting turmeric together with oil and cooking is a better thing for more readily absorbable curcumin. So that's, just remember that for your cooking. Put fat together with the turmeric. And also curcumin helps to upregulate antioxidant defense. It may help mobilize brain amyloid, and it protects the brain mitochondria, which is really important for energy production. What about carotenoids? All of the different plant compounds that we see in nature, the whole gamut. You know, when I think of carotenoids, many people think of beta-carotene, but really we're talking about 650 different carotenoids. Well, there was a study. This was just released this year in 2014. It was in just about 3,000 middle-aged people. They gave them 6 tests, 6 cognitive tests, and they found that carotenoids in the diet were associated with a higher cognitive score. So the more carotenoids somebody had in their blood, and this is looking at the whole complex, many different carotenoids, the better, and that would be a marker of plant food consumption. And what they showed is that the people had better cognition. So what foods are high in carotenoids? Well, there are lots of them out there. Carrots, of course, we think of. Kale has carotenoids. Tomatoes, I've already mentioned, has lycopene. Spinach, mangoes, pumpkin, these are some of the higher sources of carotenoids. Now, what about green and yellow? When we think of colorful compounds in plant foods, we typically think of green foods, right? You might even think of spinach. Well, there are so many different phytonutrients contained in the category of these green leafy vegetables that can be health promoting for the brain, for sure. So one of the things that we have in these green leafy vegetables is lutein. Kale is an excellent source of lutein, and it was shown that when people have low levels of lutein in their blood, that they don't have a good return, a good outcome after having a stroke. So, but people that had higher levels of lutein, who had had a stroke, had a better outcome. So they were more functionally stable. So again, thinking about the brain health, we have to think about stroke. So what are some commonly consumed foods and sources of lutein? Well, I mentioned kale, of course, and that is high on the list, but there are some others that are perhaps even at parity or a little bit higher. Basil is a great source. Parsley is an incredibly rich source. Spinach is also great. Leek, lettuces of various types, broccoli, and believe it or not, red pepper can contain appreciable amounts of lutein as well. So get some variety there. Now, what about the avocado? Is that good for the brain? Well, I would give it a thumbs up because an avocado added to a hamburger seems to reduce a lot of inflammation after eating it compared to just eating that hamburger alone. And if we're concerned about inflammation when it comes to the brain, we definitely want to be pulling in things to quell that inflammation. So avocado would be perfect. And also avocado contains good healthy fats, monounsaturated fats, the same kind that are in olive oil. So you're getting those for a good healthy brain matter composition. And phytosterols, gosh, there's so much good stuff in avocado. So if you're not allergic to them for any reason, it might be a good idea to just get, even if it's a quarter or half of an avocado on a daily basis, or a fairly regular basis if it is good for your health conditions. Green tea is another one that I feel is so protective. When I'm doing lots of traveling and on the plane and being subject to lots of oxidative stress and things that aren't so good for my brain, I do try to get more green tea. Green tea helps to protect those neurons. Those protective compounds in green tea help to act as these free radical scavengers. So they're protecting the brain and allowing it to do its thing. These green tea catechins might also be beneficial in memory and learning and may improve cognitive alertness. So that's definitely a good thing, right? When we look at the compounds in green tea, typically we see flavonoids as one of the classes of those compounds. These are plant compounds. And there was a study that showed that when we have more flavonoids in the diet, that we get less risk of dementia. 41% reduced risk of dementia with higher, greater dietary intake of flavonoids. That's pretty phenomenal if you think about it. And 1 cup of black tea alone has more than the dose of flavonoids that they even looked at in the study. So you're getting your daily dose just by having a cup of tea. There are a number of different flavonoid-containing foods that you can choose from. So I mentioned the green tea, cacao beans, parsley has flavonoids, and then also, of course, some fruits, plum, elderberry, and there are many different foods that contain flavonoids. I'm just putting the higher flavonoid-containing foods up here. What's also really interesting about flavonoids is that they seem to bind to a certain site in the brain that help to relax us. So it's kind of interesting, right? Because, you know, if we're sitting down to have tea, are we relaxed because of the sitting down to have the tea or because of what's in the tea? And there might be caffeine in the tea, so, you know, we might feel a little bit of opposition to that relaxing effect. But it seems that these flavonoids can bind to, there's a benzodiazepine site on one of the receptors in the brain, and that can kind of result in that kind of feeling of tiredness or just relaxing us. And these, several of them within the plant kingdom and within this flavonoid family seem to bind to that receptor. So really interesting that we might be able to improve just our overall mood. All right, saving the best for last, talking about blue-purple phytonutrients. Blue-purple, as I mentioned before, is really specific for the brain. In fact, we know that the berry fruits are involved in several different pathways in the brain. So they're involved in reducing inflammation and helping the cells to survive. They create neuronal plasticity, as we've been talking about, that communication between the nerves, and even the connection and communication between nerves or neurons. So that's pretty exciting that berries can do so much in the brain. And berries contain a phytonutrient compound called proanthocyanidins. We can actually find these proanthocyanidins in a number of different foods: cocoa beans, cinnamon. You'll note that I also have baking chocolate on here. So these dark foods, they seem to contain a lot of these proanthocyanidins as well. But of course, I would go with berries as one of my first choices. And people ask, you know, how do I get more blue-colored foods? You know, it may not be so easy. So all I would say here is when you have the option to choose for blue-purple, go that route and see if you can get some variety in your eating. So if you happen to choose, let's just say you have corn chips, not necessarily a good healthy food, but let's just say that you have them, and some people do them occasionally. Well, would it be better to have white or blue corn chips? Well, this slide right here would show us that it's much better to have blue corn, that you get much more in the way of nutrient density in the blue corn than you do in the yellow corn or the white corn. If you get a choice between orange carrots or purple carrots, try the purple carrots. They might be more expensive, but they're giving you much more in the way of nutrients, so you're actually eating smarter. When it comes to blueberries, there are different levels of phytonutrients in the different berries, and typically the more small and stressed the berry is, the higher it will be in these phytonutrients. So go with the more tart berries that have more skin to the inner flesh. What about purple potatoes? Have you ever tried those? The purple Peruvian potatoes, they're wonderful. They're low glycemic. They're not starchy like the big fluffy russet potatoes, and they're very flavorful and colorful. And I try to bring them into my eating whenever I can. It's not always possible. They're not always at every grocery store, but when I do see them, I try to get them. And sometimes you'll find the tricolor potato bag. So you get the small gold, the red, and then the purple, and that's also really nice to have that variety. So there are lots of different phytonutrient-containing foods out there. We talked about a lot of them. When it comes to the top superfoods, you want to be thinking of just getting a variety of colors, and again, with a nice focus on the blue-purple. So thinking about everything from carrots to collard greens, beet greens, broccoli, kale, watercress, arugula, spinach, strawberries, blackberries. Don't forget that study with strawberries and blueberries leading to 2.5 greater cognitive years compared to people that didn't have those strawberries and blueberries. So if we put it all together and we say, well, gosh, what does a brain meal look like? We might say that it contains lots of greens, might have some fish in there because of the omega-3s, the good healthy brain fats, some avocado, some olives, and just lots of leafy greens in general to give us the the folates that we need for good, healthy brain function, the chlorophyll, just all the different compounds, the phytonutrients that are helping our brain to work better. Now, I spent a lot of time talking about what we eat and how that impacts the brain. I also don't want to leave this conversation without talking about how much we eat and how that impacts the brain. So what we're learning is that having a little bit of stress in the way of eating, now that may not sound like a very good thing to say stress and eating in one sentence, but essentially there is this fancy term called hormesis, and hormesis means that sometimes we need to kind of stress or shake up our system in such a way to help it see things more definitively. And so, well, and what I mean by that is, like, just imagine if we have a couch potato lifestyle, we're just kind of sitting, we're eating the same foods. It doesn't give our body enough of a stretch. We need to have that dynamic tension that gets us to grow and to reach and create that plasticity in the body. So hormesis connects to what we were talking about very early on in this webinar, talking about neuronal plasticity, metabolic flexibility, and heart rate variability. So we need to be looking at what can we do in order to kind of provoke our bodies to be stimulated and have that dynamic tension. One of the things is not eating so much. Having too much food kind of puts us in that la-la land of not really being able to effectively respond to that meal. So there was a study in which they looked at monkeys, and they had one group of monkeys that were told that they could eat as much as they want, and then another group of monkeys that were told, well, or actually given 20% less calories compared to the first group. And what they found was that the title of the article was Caloric Restriction Delays Disease Onset and Mortality in Rhesus Monkeys. Pretty fantastic to think that just by reducing our calories a bit, that we don't have so much disease. And it's the same even for neurological-based diseases, things like dementia. Now, there was a very recent article that came out earlier this year in 2014 in January, which looked at energy restriction, meaning toning down our calories a little bit, and various neurological disorders, and one of which was Alzheimer's disease. What they showed was that with various types of reducing energy intake, and that could be from reducing calories for CR. If you're looking at my slide, you would see CR is the number of studies on caloric restriction, intermittent fasting, or dietary restriction. You know, all the different ways to kind of cull back on how much we're eating. What they found is that for Alzheimer's disease, epilepsy, ALS, stroke, Parkinson's, that in some way there were some studies that were all suggesting that it might be beneficial to have a little bit of energy restriction, to reduce calories a little bit, so we're not inundating our mitochondria. All right, and now let's also focus on how we eat. Now, when it comes to the amount of fasting and all of that, definitely work with a healthcare provider, because that, you know, you might have various types of conditions that might warrant that you eat certain things at certain times. One of the things that I do personally, I'll just talk about that, is I do a longer, I'm sure you've heard the phrase, not to eat 3 hours before you go to bed, right? And I more or less, I try to keep to that as much as possible, and I notice that my health is very different when I do that. So if I stop eating by 7 at night and then wake up in the morning and start eating at about 8 a.m., 7:30, you know, that gives me about a 12-hour fast that I've just done at night. And I like it because it just helps me to restore, feel more clear-headed when I wake up. I notice that if I eat closer to bed, I just don't feel as good when I wake up. I might feel more fuzzy and just might be more difficult for me to wake up. So I like the idea of us doing lots of restoring at night. All right, so to close, how we eat. And as I mentioned, we get into these food ruts. So how do we get some more neuronal plasticity with our meal? How do we start to shake things up? One of the things that was done in this study was they looked at mindfulness. Now, how do we bring in more mindfulness with our meals? And what we can do is help change our glycemic response which again is connected to cognition, just by being mindful. In fact, I found this study fascinating because these were type 2 diabetics, and these type 2 diabetics were trained in mindfulness and had to do a mindful-based stress reduction over 12 weeks. And without changing anything else, they were able to improve their glycemic control, which was assessed by looking at their things like their hemoglobin A1C, things like their, they looked at body weight. That wasn't significant, but definitely glycemic control just by being more mindful. Now, within the how, I also want to toss in how we prepare our foods. If there's something that I feel most passionate about when it comes to the brain, it's making sure that we do not get a lot of these browned products that form with cooking. Because what are those brown products? Well, there is a chemical reaction that occurs in food when we put protein and sugar under the influence of heat. So when that happens, we get that brown color. That brown color denotes that you have the formation of what we call advanced glycation end products. Now that's a fancy term to denote that you've just created something really inflammatory. Now even look at the acronym AGE. AGE, Advanced Glycation End Product. And what these advanced glycation end products do, in other words, the brown products that form with aging, is they come into the cell and they can increase inflammation. They can start to change our DNA expression of all kinds of inflammatory markers. So that's not a good thing. In fact, these AGEs are talked about in the literature quite extensively. They even call them gerontotoxins, meaning the toxins of aging. And they talk about Alzheimer's disease. In this particular article, and again, these are scientific studies, it says advanced glycation end products as biomarkers and gerontotoxins, a basis to explore methylglyoxal lowering agents for Alzheimer's disease. So in other words, what they're saying is maybe this is one way to get at Alzheimer's disease is by looking at these advanced glycation end products. They also show that one of the forms of AGEs, the advanced glycation end products that form, is called methylglyoxal. And what they showed is that people that have this compound in their brain also have greater cognitive dysfunction or poor memory and executive function. So what I would say is my takeaway from all of this, being in the literature, being in clinical practice, doing this myself, is that it's important to get a variety of colors and try to stretch yourself in terms of, you know, if you always do red foods, try to get some green foods, blue, purple, and orange, and yellow. I think it's important to get a wider variety of these phytochemicals. And there are many different ways to do that. You can make an easy switch, like switching from mashed potatoes to sliced carrots. Another one that I like is just going from mashed potatoes to mashed cauliflower. What about switching from corn to spinach? Corn is in everything, and we get so much of it. What about just adding in some vegetables to pasta? If you like pasta, you know, that might be a way, or eggs, or eating more stir fries. Stir fries are great medleys of different colors that can come together. Or even adding rinds of oranges or lemons to water. You can add oranges or lemons or even herbs to chicken and fish if that's what you eat. Eating fruit salads that are a complex variety of different things, and just colorful salads in general. There are so many easy ways, and just pick one and see if you can do it. All right, so in summary here, it's really important to get these phytonutrients, to be thinking about our blood sugar. Is our body inflamed? Do we have good levels of insulin and glucose? Because all of these things are going to connect to brain health. And phytonutrients, because they connect to things like inflammation, they connect to glucose and insulin, they can help us with our brain health potentially. So focus on the quality of colors and how you cook and even how you eat if you do want a better brain. And if you'd like to get in touch with me, feel free to do so. You can visit my website at www.foodandspirit.com. I also post daily on my Food and Spirit with Dr. Deanna Minich page Feel free to visit me there. Would love to hear from you and have any questions answered. Thanks so much.